going to talk a little bit about the sort of topic that I chose, but I'm not going to stick very closely to it. Is there a new era in the coverage of Africa? For the media coverage of Africa. I'm not. I think things have changed a lot. I have been, as Kevin says, I was a journalist. I worked for Business Day for a long time, and then I was the editor of a Pan-African magazine owned by West Africans, Business in Africa. There was some. I've forgotten your name now, but we used to have something to do with each other on that magazine. That was in the late 90s, before Africa really was on the radar of people in South Africa, and. I think that, and subsequently to that, I have my own company, Africa at Work, and I do writing. I still do a lot of writing, including my Business Day column, and I've just done a book on business in Africa, interviewing a lot of business leaders about what their experiences are, etc., etc. I've just got these pictures. I really just want to kind of set the tone. I didn't come with this for you guys. This is actually from one of my book launches, but I saw you had a screen set up, so I thought I would just quickly run through it. This picture is taken in Maputo, which is now becoming one of the ports that is in competition to Durban. Maputo is becoming a favoured port. Durban is a long way from the rest of Africa, and I think companies are finding it very expensive to move goods down from the DRC and places like that, and they're looking for alternative ports. Walvis Bay, Maputo are both positioning themselves for this, so that's it's something as Durban is expanding its facilities, we are seeing a bit of a pullback from other African countries for security reasons, for distance, for cost, and so on. So that is just, as I say, a random picture of Maputo Port. This is a shopping centre being built in Nigeria by South African developers and with international money. It's in Abuja. It's the first. There's a lot of talk about ShopRite being the biggest supermarket in Africa, and yes, it is. But I think you have to keep some perspective. And ShopRite was the anchor tenant in this and many other shopping centres around the rest of Africa. But ShopRite really, I don't have the figures straight in my head, but relatively speaking, 500 plus supermarkets in South Africa, probably about 70 in the rest of Africa. So I think it gives you some perspective on how things are not, I think there's a lot of hype around Africa's development, everything's happening in Africa, new frontier, all of that stuff. I think we just have to keep a sense of relativism about some of these issues. This shopping centre, this is in the middle of Nigeria, and really I think the building of this highlights a lot of the problems around Africa, that you're doing business in Africa that still exist. That would be bureaucracy, trying to get the land tenure sorted out in a way that it can't be overturned in a heartbeat. Trying to find skilled construction companies, skilled labour, trying to find places where they make the right tiles, where they make air conditioners, and most of the stuff still comes from South Africa or it comes directly from Asia. So that's just the pictures. I'm just going to talk to the pictures just to give some sort of context to this. This is in Kigali, which is one of the Rwanda is one of the big up-and-coming countries. It's a very small country. It is politically stable, but I think there are concerns about the change of leadership from Paul Kagame, given the history of Rwanda, so that may not last. But the interesting thing that Rwanda has done is taken a look at the Doing Business Index that the World Bank puts out annually, where it ranks countries according to six measures of doing business and according to the ease of doing these things. And Rwanda has made a decision that they want to be the top African country on that list. And I think that's quite an interesting measure. Most African countries are near the bottom of that list. And I think we are the top African country along with Mauritius and Botswana on that particular list. But the rankings change and so on. So I think that's quite interesting that he's, the president is using that as a benchmark and making reforms accordingly to push them up the rankings, which I think is one way to look at what you should be doing right. This is a picture taken in Tete in northern Mozambique. As you might or might not know, Tete is the center of this huge coal mining investment by Brazilian company Vale. And there's, I think Rio Tinto was there, but I think there's been a change of companies in that area. But what's happening is Tete, which was then a little village, I took this a few years ago, is now becoming quite a big town, which is happening in a lot of the mining areas in Africa. There's a lot of talk about how resources doesn't filter through. There's no opportunities for job creation and so on in resources, oil and gas mining. But in fact, that's not really true, because what's happening is you're getting this huge growth in small places and a lot of job creation, not in the mining sector itself. And I think that's where sometimes the story goes wrong, is it's a lot of the opportunity is sparked by what's happening in the mining sector in these outlying areas. Sorry, these are just thrown, that's me and the Mozambique president. Sorry, this was just to brag at my book launch, so you're just going to have to put up with a few of these. This is taken in Goma in eastern DRC. As you know, Goma has been the scene of a lot of fighting, a lot of military, warlords fighting over each other with influence from Uganda and Rwanda. When I put the map up, some of this will become clearer. But Goma has had it's been the center of a lot of political battles, but actually about, I can't remember now, maybe 10 years ago, just in case things weren't going well enough in Goma, which is very far from Kinshasa, and there are no direct transport routes. A volcano exploded nearby, and the lava ran through the town and killed a lot of people and displaced hundreds of thousands of people and so on. And even today, people have come back and rebuilt it. It's not that clear in this picture, but the roads are all made of basically lava, and it is awful. It's like a horrible kind of tar, but it's things couldn't go much worse in Goma, but they did. This is just the kind of thing that you see all over Africa. The roads. I had occasion to travel from Witbank to Rustenburg the other day via Johannesburg, and it just struck me while I was sitting on the road what incredible highways we have here. You do not see this in other parts of any other part of Africa, perhaps a little bit in North Africa. And something like the N4 from Pretoria to Rustenburg is a road. I think if most African countries could have just one of those running through their countries, they'd be happy. This is the main road through I think it's through Tanzania, but this is what happens. You get one problem on the road and everybody is just backed up for miles, and there's nothing nearby for people to sort it out, and sometimes the road just caves in if it's built badly. So this all adds to the problems of logistics in Africa. Now, logistics is a huge business for a lot of companies, but it's hugely problematic, and this pushes up the cost of doing business when your goods get stuck, for example, like this, or at a border post. For a week a week at a time, which happens regularly because of failure of systems, of bureaucracy, of corruption, and so on. So that is a big headache for businesses doing business in Africa. That is another much less successful expansion than ShopRite, the Massmart discounters. That's their shop in Maputo. The Walmart acquisition has not really made, in fact, I think it slowed its African expansion considerably after the Walmart. This is just some neighborhood road building in one of the main roads in Rwanda. This is quite interesting. A lot of the complaints about ShopRite have been historically that they are not producing goods locally in the countries in which they operate. Historically, I think that was true, but I think what is not being reported, now this is a media issue which I will address later as well. For example, the media in Zambia still report that ShopRite is not sourcing its goods locally, and the NGOs are on the case, and they keep, this issue keeps being highlighted. But in fact, ShopRite over the years has built up a strong kind of group of farmers in all the countries in which they operate, and they are now starting to import stuff into South Africa from these farms, and also between their different countries, from Zambia to Tanzania or whatever. This is Nigeria, as you can see. And I think this is quite clever. They've actually identified the goods in the stores. This is in that supermarket you saw being built earlier, saying that they're actually sourced locally, and I think it's a way of helping to improve the reputation of their sourcing. That is Lagos. I don't know if anyone's been to Lagos. It's a city of many parts, but this is actually the very old part of Lagos. These are the big banks. First Bank is the gold building. Union Bank is the one next to it. Both of these have been around in different forms and under different names, and under foreign ownership as well for the past sort of 80 odd years. And they are the biggest banks in Nigeria. In fact, they both have representative offices in South Africa, and they're both expanding quite rapidly across both Nigeria and in some cases the continent. That's a border post. I told you earlier about the problems of logistics, huge delays, trucks sitting there for days, and that's also been a problem in the contributing problem, a factor rather, in the spread of HIV/AIDS because of trucks being stuck here for long periods. A lot of women, a lot of businesses being built up around these border posts. That's also Nigeria. Quite a curious thing, seeing horses suddenly walking around there. That's one of the big banks as well. There's a lot of improvements happening in Lagos. It's a whole story on its own. This is, we still don't have the infrastructure around the continent. That's a border crossing at Kazangula, actually where I grew up in Zimbabwe, across to Zambia on the other side. We're still having to, and these ferries sometimes sink and they sometimes don't go, and so trucks once again are backed up along that's John Kufuor, the former president of Ghana. That is a picture of Lagos. It's sort of, it does look like everyone's kind of worst nightmare of urbanization, and a lot of it in fact is that. These are people just living, there's such rapid urbanization in Lagos that people are expanding off the land into the sea, and into shacks basically in the water itself. And there's no power and there's no running water and that kind of thing. And that's salt water obviously that they're living on, because Lagos is on the sea. I'll show you when we get to the map. That's also a port in Lagos. A lot of trade happening in the rest of Africa. I think I'll talk a bit to that. That's Beira, which is actually starting to revive along Mozambique coast. This is also Kigali, just showing the thing with shopping centres, and people may talk a lot about it. There aren't that many shopping centres, but one of the challenges is also is trying to, there's a lot of issues around people shopping in shopping centres. People are much more used to shopping in this kind of way. You are getting the returning middle class. People are wanting to shop in nicer areas and in importantly air-conditioned malls and so on. But people there's too few of them to lure people away from this more traditional kind of shopping at this stage. That is the Radisson Blu Hotel in Lagos. Lagos is a city made up of creeks and rivers and things like that. It's a very water-based city, and a lot of the upmarket areas are actually on islands joined by bridges. We just hope that there's no tsunami there, because Lagos would pretty much go off the map. That's a former Minister of Finance in Mozambique. That picture is taken in Liberia. Nairobi, not one of the most attractive cities in the world, but Kenya is a very structured, unlike East-West Africa, very different. West Africa is much less structured, more dysfunctional, less organized. East Africa is far more, I suppose, more similar to what we understand here about the way things work and so on. And so the history is the British colonial history has been more similar there and in Southern Africa than in West Africa, which is mostly French speaking. Also Lagos. This bridge, by the way, is about the only legacy of the oil boom from the 1970s in Nigeria, where the whole country sort of turned to oil and agriculture was just run into the ground. Everybody wanted quick money, and they built these huge highways across the sea in Lagos. As I said, it's a very water-based city, but at the end of the day, that oil it's really been a resource curse in Nigeria, and that's about the only thing that's really left of value. That is Dangote's cement plant in Nigeria. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dangote because I want to just raise the issue about the coverage of African business in South Africa. That is in Nairobi. It's just some of the other sort of shopping. That's the way people shop, really, is on the streets and so on. That is the new shopping centre in Lusaka. That is very much replicated of what we have here, built by Liberty Properties, a lot of South African tenants, which you'll see all over Africa. Our supermarket chains are still anchor tenants in just about every supermarket shopping centre. It's another picture of Lagos, a different view of the bridge across the sea. Huge urban decay and neglect, which also is an issue that affects the way South Africans relate to Nigerians, which I'll explain a bit later. They look at that and think, well, this place is a mess and it's all run down and things don't work. So the people, in some way, I think deep down people think, well, the people are also not very sophisticated because the place looks like that. And that's actually not the case. And I think that has been a key problem in the South African-Nigeria relationship. That's the president of Nigeria, good luck Jonathan, not having much good luck during his second term. Lagos Airport used to be one of the worst in the world, known widely as one of the worst airports in the world because of the corruption and so on. It's still not a great place, but it's, anyway, they say they're improving it, we'll see. And then this is from our book launch. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to close that down, and I just wanted to give you some sort of flavor of. Do you want to come and just put up the map for me? I just think it's important to have the map because I think it's very easy to forget where things are in relation to other things and where we are in relation to everybody else. And just to get back to the media thing that I said I would talk about, I think In the late 1990s, when I was the editor of Business in Africa magazine, I think there were 2 or 3 magazines looking at business in Africa outside South Africa that were actually in this country. And at the time, there was a lot of business happening. In 1999 was when MTN went into Nigeria, for example, which is now its biggest market, even bigger than South Africa. There was a lot of stuff starting to happen. And I think it was not long after that the Economist had this headline, "The Hopeless Continent," that everybody repeats endlessly. I think that says more about the Economist than it does about Africa. Then a few years later they said, "Oh no, this is the continent of promise," or I can't remember what the second headline was. And everybody always quotes this. I think the Economist gets a lot of credit for covering Africa that it doesn't deserve. That's my personal view, because I think they just really follow the trends. And a lot of stuff at the time that the Hopeless Continent came out, there was a lot of new investment going into Africa from all over, particularly from South Africa. South Africa was the biggest investor in the rest of Africa, sort of in the late 90s, early part of the century, and we have subsequently been overtaken by a whole range of other actors, which China and obviously being the key among them. And but at the same time, also the coverage of Africa was very much about conflict and so on. And I think there's 2 things. I remember when in 1999 on this African Business magazine, we actually ran a story about the first African who'd been appointed to run the BBC bureau in Africa. He was a South African whose name escapes me now. But that was so newsworthy at the time because at that time and for many years, the foreign media did not hire Africans to cover their own continent. They sent in foreigners because there were various different issues about that. It's like, they have partisan views about their own country. You don't know whether they're going to be reporting it independently in conflict, internal problems like Rwanda genocide. Are Rwandans going to be able to dispassionately cover a story like that? And there were a whole lot of issues around that. But I think now we really do have quite a growing number of Pan-African kind of journalists, presenters. You see them on CNN now. And so increasingly I think the African story has a more nuanced kind of air to it because we're having Africans themselves looking at it. Not necessarily only covering their own countries, which I think was I think it was sort of patronizing to assume that was always going to have to be the case. So, and then you're getting a lot of online media. There's a big growth in private media, which you didn't have at one time. African governments have always been very strong in terms of controlling information. You still see that in Zimbabwe. I don't know if any of you have been covering that. Actually, I meant to ask before we started, is anyone here from another African country other than South Africa? Are you all South Africans? Okay. Where are you from? Oh, okay. And you? Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, Ethiopia, of course, is a classic example of how the government has not yet opened up the space. I think you can't even pick up Google search engine there. Is that right? I don't know if you've been tracking it lately, but yeah, the government very strongly government controlled, and in fact, the World Economic Forum had their Africa Summit there last year, and they had to. The condition was that they would have to open up the access to the internet in order for them to agree to do it there. So they did open it up for the time that the World Economic Forum ran, and then they closed it all down again. But then the president died soon after. And in Zimbabwe, you still see that where radio stations, and radio is a very big. Print journalism is much smaller in the rest of Africa than it is certainly in South Africa. Although you have a proliferation of newspapers, partly because it's very prestigious to own a newspaper. People have political agendas that they need to run, and they use the media to do it. You don't. Certainly in smaller markets, you don't have the big newspaper groups. You do have in some countries, like for example in Kenya, you've got the Nation Group, which is a very big, has one of the best newspapers I think in Africa, which is the East African. It's a regional newspaper that covers a weekly regional newspaper. In Nigeria, you've got Business Day, which is actually not owned, contrary to popular opinion, by Business Day South Africa. Actually, what happened there was, and it happens a lot in Nigeria because people don't trademark their brands and they don't register their brands until they've decided to go into a country. And it's been a problem for a lot of people once they decide they do want to go into a country, only to find that actually they are already there in some form. And that happened with Business Day. A newspaper was launched in Nigeria, called itself Business Day, borrowed Business Day's masthead, had clearly been to South Africa, liked the product, And so when Business Day decided it would buy a newspaper in Nigeria, it went in and found that actually it had to buy that newspaper or change its brand entirely. So you're getting more business coverage, and that's it's a much more recent phenomenon. And I think that is how you see it happening in South Africa as well, where business and the economy, there's a much greater appreciation of the importance of this, because the politics and business and economic issues are hugely intertwined. But nevertheless, a lot of the new interest in Africa is not just because there are few conflicts and that there's a growth of democracy. It's really because there are huge investment opportunities here. And it's not just in resources. You see a lot of investment in consumer industries and so on, particularly in the last few years. I think what China and the BRICS countries have done is really drawn attention to Africa at the same time, more or less, that African economies themselves were starting to reform and build and make it easier to do business. And that was almost a parallel process. But I think in the meantime, what happened is that people started looking at Africa in a different way because of this huge interest coming from the BRICS countries, who have a very different notion of risk and than South Africans do, and certainly Western investors or developed country investors. But now just to get to the media in South Africa, as I say, I used to work at Business Day. I've been writing this column now for 9 years, every fortnight. It's quite taxing, I can tell you. So if you see a column that seems particularly weak, just know it was an off day and that there's another 300 of them that you can look at that were better. But I think, my problem with South Africa has been that and I think this is a consequence partly of business as well. I said before we were a big investor in the rest of Africa. What you need to remember is that a big investment in one or two countries can change the whole dynamic of that investment profile because these economies are so small. So you get a big mining investment in Mozambique, that will make you a big investor in that country because it only takes 2 or 3 investments to change those figures quite dramatically. But and so MTN, for example, a lot of our profile companies were high profile, MultiChoice, MTN, ShopRite, consumer-facing industries, which certainly put us on the radar because people recognized that they could tap in, and African consumers were interfacing with those companies as well. So that really highlighted our presence and our move into the rest of Africa. But that said, it's taken, there was the first kind of wave of companies that went into the rest of Africa after '94. But a lot of big companies have certainly taken a very long time to decide to go into other countries. If you look at Tiger Brands, they only just really made a move about 2 years ago to acquire companies in Nigeria and Kenya. There was yes, I kept this here just to show you today's paper. The headline: Old Mutual snaps up major stake in a Kenyan lender. Old Mutual's just gone into Nigeria as well. This is one of our biggest companies that has been obviously in Southern Africa for a long time to think about, should we go into the rest of Africa? And what's making it easier for these companies is the fact that African companies themselves are growing. That's been for me one of the big changes that's happened in the rest of Africa. And that is what's not being reported in the media here. I actually ran a conference, and this is not sour grapes, by the way. I think it really highlights some of the issues here. But I ran a conference for a Zimbabwean client last week, looking at 4 stock exchanges in the region: Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Botswana. And we had 7 or 8 companies in a range of sectors, from power right through to consumer goods and so on, talking about their experiences, about their political risk analysis going forward. They've all got different risks in their region and so on. 7 companies, some of them, the biggest performers in the region. Inscore, for example, which is very big in Zimbabwe, and it has operations, franchises all the way up to Nigeria. We had Zimplow, which has got, they make plows. They export to South Africa as well as all over the continent. CEC, which is Copperbelt Energy Corporation in Zambia, which is actually doing deals in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, etc. And not one journalist came to that. Couldn't interest Business Day, couldn't interest Financial Mail, Mail and Guardian, all of these newspapers that actually say, well, actually we are interested in Africa. And I just thought it was a lost opportunity. There's really good information looking at, you could interweave the political dynamics in Zimbabwe with what's happening there. You had top, business executives to ask. Now, I think one of the problems and this has happened over the years. I run a lot of, one hat I have is I'm the head of the South Africa-Nigeria Chamber of Commerce. So we do a lot of Nigerian events, and likewise, difficult to interest the press unless there is a minister or well, obviously the president. But in fact, you get much less information often that way than just talking to senior business people and so on. And I mentioned Dangote because finally Dangote seems to be kind of on the radar of South Africans are starting to know who Aliko Dangote is. Now, who he is, who knows who Dangote is? Who's familiar with him? Okay, you see, that's not enough, really. I think it almost diminishes the point I was just trying to make. Aliko Dangote is a Nigerian, I say he's a cement magnate. Actually, what he's done is he's expanded his cement business into 14 African countries, including South Africa, where he did a deal with Sipaku Cement, who had the license for the limestone that he wanted. He's actually also Africa's richest man, which is most often how he's described. I think that in some ways diminishes his achievements. He's probably worth double what Nicky Oppenheimer is worth. And this is really over a period of sort of 10 years, he's built up this huge empire and fortune. And yet, we're not even really reporting him here. Occasionally you see his face on Forbes Africa, who always tap into the low-hanging fruit when they're looking for stories. And so on. And I mean, I was going to ask you about, does anyone here know who EcoBank is? Or where they come from? EcoBank, okay, good. Yeah. Well, in a way, they're based in Togo, but they're actually a West African-owned bank. They're actually owned by people from across the region. EcoBank is in 30, we talk a lot about Standard Bank, and of course they're hugely, much more capitalized than EcoBank, for example. But Standard Bank is in 17, I think they've got banking operations in 17 countries, 22 operations in total. But EcoBank's in 32 African countries. UBA, United Bank for Africa, is one of the companies I interviewed for my book. Also a Nigerian bank, they're also in, I think, 23 or so countries in Africa. And these are companies you've never heard of. Inscore, I just said, in Zimbabwe, are right across Africa. They've got businesses, they make white goods. I don't think they must be the only company in the whole of Africa that actually makes white goods and doesn't import them from Asia. Seedco, which is a big seed organization that is right across Africa. They've just gone into West Africa. Kenyan supermarkets, they're right across the region. They're looking at Nigeria. They're looking at Southern Africa as well in competition with ShopRite. There's many more. I should have actually put a whole list, and in fact I might do that. I think it might be useful for you to see maybe a list. I can perhaps email it to Kevin. Of the 20, I think if you read Africa Report, they list a lot of the top African companies, but you'll find a lot of those are subsidiaries of, like it'll be Barclays Kenya or whatever it is. There'll be a subsidiary of a big developed country multinational, which is a bit different from looking at homegrown multinationals, and that's the big change that's happening. And I think that's making it a lot easier for South Africans to find companies to buy, because these are improving companies. They're becoming more corporatized. A lot of them have started life as family-owned companies. They've now grown really big. And I think the challenge for South Africans is, for example, Nigerian banks, they have a very high tolerance for risk. I think South African business people often think that they are very risk-friendly, but in fact, I think it's fair to say South Africans are pretty risk-averse when it comes to doing business in other African countries. They sit on the fence a long time. The Nigerians have a phrase for the South Africans. They say that they constrained by analysis paralysis. That they take years and years to fiddle with the deal and look at it and think, is it too expensive? And by that time, somebody else has come along and snapped it up. So I think that's a big challenge for African companies. We talk a lot about BRICS companies coming into the continent, but actually African companies themselves are presenting huge competition for. For example, Inscore owns the Spa brand in Zimbabwe and Zambia, hugely successful, and basically they've sort of swallowed up that market. Pick and Pay has just gone into Zambia, but they're very late in the day. What they did is when ShopRite decided to go into the rest of Africa, Pick and Pay decided to go to Australia. Pick and Pay got a huge hiding in Australia. ShopRite, as we know, is expanding. They're expanding only as fast as they can get shopping malls to go up, but they have, they would have many more stores if they could just find the premises, if you like, to do it. So I just think that, and the South African newspapers don't reflect any of this. Even in the late 90s when I was working on the magazine, those flights were full going into the rest of Africa. And yet, you couldn't interest a news editor in this town to even think about writing a story about the rest of Africa that wasn't political, that wasn't about a coup. We were replicating the foreign journalist story in South Africa by just talking about the battle between Mugabe and Changarai rather than what was happening in the economy, which of course was in the end the big story and the whole thing, and the one thing that changed Zimbabwe in the end was the economy. And yet we weren't covering it in this country, barely touching it, except just looking at the political story. And there's nothing wrong with that. The political story is important, but I think the differentiator should be that we are part of Africa. We should know who these companies are. News editors should be taking more of an interest. And I think one of the problems is that news editors, copy tasters, for example, Reuters, Bloomberg, all of these, there's really interesting stuff. I find it all the time on the internet. And yet you don't find it in our newspapers. And what has happened as a result of this is the sort of deficit. And I know how many people are doing business in Africa and how many people are interested in it and thinking about it and so on. There's just been a mushrooming of online newsletters. A lot of them started originally by the banks who saw the information gap. Their clients wanted information, they weren't getting it in the media, so they set these things up, and you still get a lot of that today. So people have made a lot of money out of that, and the newspapers have basically lost the business. Business Day decided to do a whole Africa strategy, and what they've done really is they've just sent someone to the AU to cover the AU, and I don't think that's a bad thing to do. I think it's quite important that we know about what's happening there. But likewise, it's not, the business deals are completely ad hoc. There seems to be no real strategy about covering the rest of Africa, and I think it's a real lost opportunity in an era where, for example, advertising is going away. I mean, the Nigerians' banks, for me, are an opportunity to tap into. They want to reach the South Africans, partly to show off because they've got so big, but it's partly because, they're looking for South African companies to bank with them in Nigeria and all over the rest of the continent. And things like that, but because people don't understand the dynamic, how big it is, who the players are and so on, that revenue is just going elsewhere. You're finding those people advertising in other parts. Often see on CNN, actually, the Nigerian banks will advertise there. I just think there's a lot of opportunities there that are not being tapped into because we don't understand these companies enough. We don't understand the dynamics enough. We talk a lot about BRICS without really understanding, I think, what that means. The media is always talking about China and Brazil and so on. What does that mean? What is our response to that? My personal view about South Africa's real fight to get into to head up the African Union was based on its membership of BRICS, because this government suddenly realized they don't have the political connections and acceptance in the rest of Africa that they thought they had, and basically our presence in BRICS is premised on our being an African country, not being South Africa specifically. And I think that you've seen a real step up in the whole issue about relaxing exchange controls for business into Africa, positioning ourselves as the gateway into Africa, although we've been the de facto gateway for decades. But the government has suddenly thought, the Chinese want to use us for this, and we're now part of BRICS. That's my sense of it anyway, that suddenly this economic diplomacy has gone up a gear, and suddenly we are paying attention to the rest of Africa in a way that we should have done all along, because this market has been on our doorstep. And I won't go into it now, but there's a lot of issues between Nigeria, South Africa as the big players on the continent, and it's an area that I get involved a lot, and I get it from both sides on what the problems are and so on. And it's quite an interesting dynamic. I think that's a topic possibly for another day. But so I think I'll leave it there. I just really wanted to share some of that stuff and get you thinking about this in another way. I just picked on this because it was lying here when I came in, so it's not that I'm picking on Business Report at all. But the in brief, I think there was, no, hang on, that's not even it. There was an in brief with African snippets in it, and that seemed to be the Africa page. Oh, here it is here. There's the official Africa page in this newspaper. And Business Day has the same thing. They have an Africa page that has no African news on it on some days, which I always find astonishing. You can know what's happening in any stock exchange in Europe, but there's never any reporting on what's happening on the Nigerian stock exchange, which is the next biggest one in sub-Saharan Africa. Egypt is far bigger than that. I've left North Africa. I'm kind of really talking about sub-Saharan because I think I've travelled to all the countries actually in North Africa except for Libya, but it is quite disconnected from us, despite there's a real political push that we're part of NEPAD, that they really want to be part of Africa, but realistically, economically, that's not the case. So I'm really, in all of this, I'm kind of referring really to sub-Saharan Africa.